This video is designed to introduce you to component 1 of the Eduqas Media Studies GCSE. I'll talk you through what you might expect from the paper, the format of the paper, the type of questions that you'll get, and then look at an example paper and talk you through how to approach some of those questions. So the paper is broken down into two sections, Section A and Section B. The total paper is 1 hour and 30 minutes. You get an unseen source which you are expected to spend 10 minutes looking at and annotating and thinking about. That leaves 1 hour and 20 minutes, so 80 minutes for an 80-mark paper. The maths therefore is not too difficult. You get 1 minute per mark in this paper. So Section A is worth 45 marks, but with the 10 minutes to analyse the unseen text, you are advised by Eduqas to spend 55 minutes on this section of the paper. Students often ask, how much should we write for each question? Well, as a rough guide, we suggest that every 15 marks should be around 1 page of A4. Now that obviously depends on your handwriting, so that's a rough guide. That's approximately 250 words for a 15-mark answer. Question 1 is a media language question, and you will be asked about either of the adverts, so that's Quality Street and the This Girl Can advert. You could be asked about the magazine covers, so that's Pride and GQ. You could be asked about the film posters, Spectre and The Man with the Golden Gun, and you might also be asked about the newspaper front covers. If you are watching this in advance of the PPEs at the Pig at School, then please note that we haven't studied newspapers yet, so that will not come up in your PPEs. But it could come up in this question, question 1, in the real exam in the summer. And you will be asked a question that's framed similarly to the one we have here. It will tell you what text the question is based on. Here it's based on Quality Street, and it will say, explore how the advertisement for Quality Street uses the following elements of media language to create meanings. And it will be framed in that way every single time, and then it will give you 3 elements of media language to explore. In this case it says images, language and layout and design. It won't always be those 3 options. For example, in the film poster it might say narrative. Narrative might be an element it asks you to look at. For the film posters it could say character types, for example. But it will be 3 sections. Images, language, layout and design are quite common, and each of those is worth 5 marks each. What that means is that you have to answer all 3 elements. This isn't a 15-mark question that's marked as a whole. You get 5 marks for talking about images, 5 marks for talking about language, and 5 marks for talking about layout and design. So if we have a think about this in more detail, then what does this mean? Then layout and design, for example, might be the rule of thirds and how the text has been composed in terms of the rule of thirds to draw the reader's eye. You might talk about colour palette. That would fit into the design element of this question. You could talk about the way in which images and text have been positioned, where they are on the page and how that draws your eye and what the significance of those positionings are. And you could talk about logos, particularly on texts such as Quality Street and This Girl Can. For language, you're looking at the words themselves. So you're going to comment on things such as language devices, for example, the use of alliteration in This Girl Can and in the Quality Street advert. You're going to look at individual word choices and what the significance of those word choices is, similarly to how you would do in an English language paper for English. You might look at the way in which the reader is addressed by the language choices in the advert. And then for images, you might consider such things as camera angles and how those are effective and the meaning that they create. You might look at the costume choices. The colour palette could also come in to images as well as in layout and design if you're talking about the images themselves. The posture or position of characters, facial expressions might be significant depending on which text you're looking at. So let's consider this then for the Quality Street advert. Well, for images, we might look at the suit as a symbol of masculine power in a patriarchal society. We might look at the way in which the colour palette has been manipulated here, so that the colours of the sweets and the women are very, very similar. And the meaning that comes out of that is this notion that both the sweets and the women are commodities to be consumed by the men in some way. You could look at the images of the Regency figures in the photo frame and draw parallels between these two time periods, the Regency period and the 1950s, both time periods of culture and prosperity. In terms of layout and design, well, colour palette again, the purple of the logo. You might talk about the connotations of purple being royalty and sophistication. You could talk about the rule of thirds and consider the way in which the man has been centrally positioned using the rule of thirds to draw our eye to him and therefore to elevate his sense of importance and power. And you might talk about the primary colour palette of this advert and the way in which that relates to the consumerist nature of 1950s society. If we're to consider language choices, the alliteration of delicious dilemma is an obvious place to start, which emphasises the power of the man's ability to choose. He has a delicious dilemma, not just in terms of chocolate, but also in terms of choosing between the two women. And delightfully different, again, the alliteration of that phrase creates a playful tone which relates to the playful nature of the product and the brand and the way in which they're trying to sell themselves. If we have a look at an example of how we might write up one of these sections then, well, media language is important here. Specific examples are important and an explanation of the effect of those examples. I'll read out the example here. The images in the Quality Street advertisement reflect attitudes of the 1950s. The use of Regency figures in the painting draws parallels between the two time periods, which were both times of wealth and relative luxury of the middle classes. Furthermore, the similarity in colour palette between the sweets and the women connects the two and highlights the way in which women were treated as commodities to be consumed in the 1950s, just as the sweets are. So that's two examples picked out from the advert and the meaning of them discussed using media language. And that's really what you need to do here. For each of these elements, A, B and C, you need two examples and the meaning discussed. 3 paragraphs such as that for your 15 marks. Question 2A is a shorter question, it's a 5 marker and it's a context question. So what this is asking you to do is to consider the context in which the product you're looking at was produced. What was society like? The roles of men and women, the treatment of ethnicities in that particular context. In this question, you're asked to look at Pride, and it says, how does context influence magazines? Refer to Pride in your answer. So you refer to the front cover of your set text of Pride with Naomi Harris on the front. What you need to ask yourself here is, what are the relevant contexts for this question and for this text? So for the Quality Street advert, you might consider the patriarchal nature of 1950s society, the way in which it was a society dominated by men. You might consider a society that's just coming out of World War II, and therefore there is this newfound sense of wealth moving out of the 1940s into the 1950s. But for Pride, that's what this question is asking us to look at. You're going to consider things such as the Black Lives Matter movement, which is relevant at the time, and the Me Too movement with a feminist ideal about female empowerment. And once you've got those contexts, you then need a couple of examples to exemplify the way in which the product reflects those contexts. So, for example, if you're talking about Black Lives Matter, you might pick out Naomi Harris's posture, her costume, and the cover line, Bond and Beyond, this empowering nature of black women in Hollywood. You could talk about objectified, sexualized, and mocked, the way in which black women are put down in society. That might be a relevant example. If you're going to look at the Me Too movement, then you might pick out cover lines such as Failed by Feminism and FGM on Harley Street. That's a 5-marker. It's one paragraph in answer to that question, with a couple of examples from the magazine to support your points. Question 2b is the long question in this section of the paper. It's essential that you leave yourself enough time to answer this question. It's a 25 marker. In this question, it's a representation question, and you will be given an unseen text and asked to compare it to one of your set texts. In this case, you're given a front cover from Glamour magazine and asked to compare the representation of women on Glamour and Pride. So you need 10 minutes to analyse and annotate the front cover of Glamour, thinking about representations of women, and then start thinking about comparisons with Pride. It's probably worth spending 10 minutes analysing the front cover, and then 5 minutes planning your comparison, and then 20 minutes writing this answer. It's a 25 marker. You're looking to write probably about a side and a quarter, 300 to 350 words probably, in answer to this question. Let's think about how we write up this question. Well, I recommend to my classes to think about this acronym SCREAM. It's quite an easy one to remember. S is for stereotypes. In any representation question, you're going to discuss the idea of stereotypes. So are the representations stereotypical or are they atypical? Are those stereotypes modern or are they outdated? C is for context. Now, the mark scheme doesn't require you to look at context here, but it's impossible to talk about stereotypes without talking about context. So in what way do the representations reflect the contexts in which they are set? We looked at context in the previous question. So here we might be thinking about Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement, these progressive notions of race, ethnicity, and gender, and looking for ways in which Pride reflects those progressive attitudes towards gender. If this was Quality Street, we would definitely be thinking about the 1950s and the way in which that text and the representations in it reflect the patriarchal nature of 1950s society. R is for representations, and this is crucial. This is what the question is asking you about. What are the representations? Are they strong? Are they powerful? Are they weak? Are they progressive? Are they dominant? Are they belittling? Try to avoid using positive or negative as a representation. It doesn't really say anything. Strong is a positive representation. Powerful is a positive representation. Weak is a negative representation, but it says more than using positive or negative. So try to get those words in instead. And this is the most important part of your paragraphs, E and A. E is for examples, and you must use specific examples from the text. Avoid generalizations. If you show the examiner that you don't know your texts very well and you don't pick out specific examples, you're going to score poorly on this question. So it must be very specific references to your set text and the unseen text you're given. And then just as important is the analysis. When you get those examples, you must talk in depth about what meaning is created by those examples. For example, what is the effect of lighting in your example? What are the connotations of the colour palette? What are the connotations of Naomi Harris's posture, facial expression, for example? And in that analysis, you must use media language. You must be using subject-specific terminology throughout. I would say E, A, and M are the most important elements of this acronym. The others help you to frame your answer, but it's the examples and the depth of the analysis and your use of terminology which is going to score you the high marks. So if we have a look at an example here then, so on the front cover of Pride we see an empowering progressive representation of black women. Straight away it's very clear that I'm answering the question. I'm talking about representation straight away. Now comes my example. The way in which Naomi Harris's skin tone is promoted in the binary of black and white promotes the significance of black women and challenges the outdated stereotype of white as beautiful as exemplified in women's magazines of the past. So here I've picked out a specific example, which is her skin tone and its contrast with the white background, and my analysis is that it elevates her significance and the significance of black women, and I can bring in stereotypes as part of my analysis there. And I can go a little bit further with some context here. This reinforces the cultural drive towards the promotion of women through movements such as Black Lives Matter. There's a bit of context just to back up my analysis. Furthermore, this representation of feminine dominance is strengthened through the way in which the main image is framed, with the hand on hip conveying a notion of confidence and defiance. Another specific example with the hand on the hip, the analysis is the connotations of confidence and defiance, and my media language comes in the form of main image and framed. And then you need to compare with the other magazine. So in contrast, Glamour magazine constructs a representation of women as, and then I can go on to do something similar to the one I've done with Pride there. In terms of terminology, for most of these texts you're going to be talking about camera shots, so you might use mid shot, long shot, close up, low angle, etc. You might talk about lighting, high key or low key lighting and the effect of that. You're almost certainly going to talk about colour palette on all of the texts that we study. For magazines, which is this question, you might use terms such as main image, cover lines and masthead. And for most of these texts you might also discuss the way in which the rule of thirds has been applied. Section B then is 35 marks, so you get 35 minutes to answer this, therefore it's 1 minute per mark. But in reality you may get a little bit more than 1 minute per mark because these are stepped questions, and the 1 mark question shouldn't really take you a minute to answer. It's a simple knowledge based question. The 2 markers are probably not going to take you 2 minutes. They're very brief questions, and that may give you a minute or 2 longer to answer the longer 12 markers that you get here. So this is based on industries and audience. The section A is based on media language and representations. So you get these stepped questions. This is where you need the simple knowledge. This is where your revision comes in. Name the organisation that regulates films in Britain. You have to know that that's the BBFC. You have to know that. 12 and 12A are examples of age certificates used in the UK. Give 2 other examples of age certificates used in the UK. This should be a very simple question if you've done your revision. Briefly explain, that's a slightly more difficult question. And then you'll get a longer question in question 3, and this one is explain why a film may be given a 12A or 12 certificate, refer to Spectre to support your points. And this is where you need to show a more detailed knowledge of one of your set texts. And then you'll move on to question 4, which is broken down into a number of stepped questions and a longer question again. And again, which radio station broadcasts the Archers? You have to know that. Identify one audience type for the Archers. You need to have this knowledge. And then you'll get the longer question at the end. Explain why audiences listen to the Archers. Refer to uses and gratifications theory in your response. Now, uses and gratifications theory is one of the 2 theories that you might specifically get asked about in the GCSE exam, the other being props character types. Now, you're really only likely to get asked about props character types in reference to the film posters. That's really the only text to which prop might apply. But uses and gratifications can be applied to any of the set texts. And here they're asking you to consider why audiences listen to the Archers, and you must refer to the theory in your response. So let's have a think about this then. As a recap, uses and gratifications theory is this idea that was developed by Bloomer and Katz in 1974, that as audiences we are no longer passive in the way we respond to media texts. We don't just sit there and accept the messages that are delivered to us, but we come to a media text with our own agenda. We want to get something from it. And Bloomer and Katz say that we get 4 possible audience pleasures from consuming a media text. One is personal identity. Now this is where a text gives you the means to construct or reinforce an element of your own identity, so you recognise a part of yourself in the text. Personal relationships, or sometimes referred to as social interaction, is where a text brings people together. Now that can either be through a shared enjoyment of the text or a text which creates a community. So for example, in the English department at the Pig at School, Bake Off and Strictly Come Dancing are 2 shows in particular which bring this sense of personal relationships or social interaction. They are the 2 shows which generate most conversation in the department office. But also it might be that a text creates a community of people or a movement of people that feel part of a family as a result of consuming the text. The third audience pleasure is diversion or escapism, where a text enables the consumer to escape the realities of everyday life. And this is often an audience pleasure for watching TV programmes and for watching films in particular. And the fourth audience pleasure that uses and gratifications says we receive is surveillance, or sometimes referred to as knowledge. And this is where a text educates the user in some way. The news would be a great example. Documentaries would be a brilliant example too. So let's think about the archers now then. And here's an example of a paragraph you might write in answer to this question. You need to consider at least 2, probably 3 of the audience pleasures as set out by uses and gratifications, and then give examples from the archers to support those audience pleasures. So here we have the archers provides its listeners with the audience pleasure of personal relationships. As a soap opera with a continuous narrative, the show creates a community of listeners, the archers' family, who are united by a shared love of the show and its characters. Moreover, listeners also receive the pleasure of personal identity. During the episode where Nick Grundy dies, the typically middle-aged and older listeners of the show will be able to relate to the pain of losing a family member and empathise with the pain expressed by Nick's husband and other family members. So what I've tried to do there is consider this notion of personal relationships and personal identity, and then show my knowledge of the text. So the first example contains some generalised knowledge of the text. So I'm showing that I understand it's a soap opera. I'm showing I understand that it has a continuous narrative and what that brings to an audience. In my second example, I'm referring specifically to the set text that we have looked at, which is the episode where Nick Grundy dies of sepsis, and given specific references to that episode to reinforce my idea. And then I'd need another audience pleasure and another specific example from the text. So, for example, other examples you might look at: the audience pleasure of routine from a daily 7 p.m. slot, the increasing variety of characters and storylines, for example, drug use and domestic abuse, and that might create a sense of personal identity, maybe for a younger audience to recognise themselves or reinforce their own identities. The original purpose of the show, which was, of course, to inform listeners about farming and agriculture in the aftermath of World War II, and we could argue that that brings the audience pleasure of knowledge and surveillance. And then if we think about our set episode, the information about sepsis that is gained from the text itself and from the information on the website after that episode was aired, and that would bring the audience pleasure of knowledge and surveillance. I hope that that introduction has been a help to you in understanding the types of questions that you are likely to get, the format of the paper, and I hope that the examples have given you a step in the right direction in terms of how you might approach these questions in the exam. Now you have the opportunity to complete this paper in your own time and also take these approaches to practice planning and writing practice answers from other papers too.